let's talk a little bit about who we humans are and what we believe. As a young boy, I was very introspective. I feel lucky to have, for whatever reasons, been challenged in ways that caused me to learn about who I am and focus really, really intently on trying to understand me, what drives me, what motivates me, what I'm interested in. And as I looked around my family, at the older folks, I had lots of questions about why people were making the choices they made to live the ways they did. My parents did not get along. It was a very, very kind of stressful environment most of the time. There was lots of arguing, lots of what I thought of as kind of inappropriate ways to communicate with one another. Very defensive, name calling, all kinds of things that were terrible from the perspective of a kid. As an adult, I think back and I realized they were doing the best they could, very, very unsuited for one another, my mother and father, and they divorced when I was 11. But my mother's family were Presbyterian, or Protestant Presbyterian, I guess, and my father's family were as well. They went to Trinity Church in Newport, Rhode Island, and my mother at some point became a Catholic. When I think about it now, it was probably because she was just trying to, I don't know, be different or rebel against what it was her folks were all about. Although her father died when she was probably 15 or so, I never met that grandfather. So who knows what really drove her to become a Catholic. But as life unfolded, my parents divorced. My father, who was originally with his parents, Presbyterian, Protestant, went to Catholic church or tried to get us to go to Catholic church because my mother was Catholic when we were growing up. That was awful and uninteresting. I was really bothered by the stand-up, sit-down, kneel, by the rote kind of nature of everything that was being expressed but never questioned. That was a very difficult time for me, trying to figure out what these people were doing. Dressed up, all superficial. I'll talk more about clothing and superficiality later when we talk about being naked. But as I got a little older, my father, after divorcing my mother, met a French woman and switched to Methodism, or Methodist. So he became a Methodist. And they went to Methodist Church in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, while my grandparents were still Presbyterian. And my mother, I guess, was still Catholic, although I don't know how much she went to church anymore. So that already set the tone for confusion a little bit. I mean, what are all the distinctions? Are there any? Are what people think are the distinctions even of value or important? Kind of like Republican and Democrat. The words almost don't mean anything. What people think when they say Republican is different, one person to another. Same with Democrat. And there's more overlap than either of them want to admit. It's crazy. Well, in religion, I think it's even more complicated than just having those two. And so as I went and left home, was in the Army, I met all kinds of fascinating, interesting people and studied pretty intently because I was intrigued by it, the beliefs of the different people that I met. For lots of different reasons. I remember at West Point, this stunningly handsome guy named Greg, who was a Mormon. And so I went with him to learn about being a Mormon and so on and so forth. So I learned many more things about many more ways of looking at the world. all throughout, I can't even come to a place where I could say was the beginning. I told you my brother was killed when I was 15. He was 13, run over by a car. And that certainly made me think more deeply about beliefs, whether or not there is a supernatural. But it wasn't the first time. For some reason, whatever reason, prior to that, I had already been believing that none of that made sense. Very little of it was even told in a way that was comprehensible. People would say things, they would say they were the same, they had the same beliefs, but they each would have different ways of believing the religion they said they were part of. Judaism, for example, is more cultural than religion for some people. Yet there are people within it, who are ultra religious, and it's not just about culture. It is a truly religious stronghold. It's all fascinating and interesting to me. The biggest part of what intrigues me about who we are as humans with respect to religion is how people believe what they believe. I don't understand how anyone believes so concretely in any of the ideas related to religion that might come across your mind. To this day, as a 58-year-old man, I'm fascinated still, but still confused by people expressing to me how solidly they believe X, Y, or Z, whatever that happens to be. In my PhD program, for example, I went to a Catholic university, Salve Regina University, and the cohort was made up of, my classmates were all relatively bright and accomplished humans who were all relatively religious. And so conversations often went to why they were religious. I was always curious and always probing and always asking. And we'd get to the point where I would question one of the reasons somebody might bring up as to why they held the beliefs they did. And eventually it always came down to, well, I just know. And I would say, well, okie dokie then. There's nothing left to say. When somebody says, I know this, I know Jesus Christ is real, I know there is a God, I know X, Y, Z, all one can say is okie dokie then. Because the second somebody says, I know this, they have communicated to you that not only are they unavailable for whatever information may be out there that controverts what they say they know, they're not interested in it either. It's a very, very interesting place that people come to really, really quickly. It's a very, very interesting place, this place where people communicate that they know these things. And they understand when I expressed, well, that's the okie dokie point. Okie dokie then, because conversation thereafter isn't really available once somebody says that. So for me, without any, angst or animosity or even the energy that people think I ought to have or perceive that I might have about the idea of whether or not a deity exists, I just don't believe there is any such thing. I don't believe there is any such thing as spiritual life or afterlife or a deity or the idea that any thing, a being, would be omniscient, all-knowing, or omnipotent, all-powerful. it's a much simpler place for me to live with the ideas and the possibilities that I don't know things than it is to conclude something and to walk around really pretending I know something when I don't. I'm okay with it, with the unknown. One really important concept related to religion that I'd like to address has to do with we humans living on Earth. Earth is a sphere, and everything to which all of us have ever been exposed is finite, which means it had a beginning, it has an end, etc. Everything is finite as compared with infinite, having had no beginning or having no end. So what we do as humans is we think about what happens after we die, what happened before we were here. We think about the infinite often, and from that we've created, I think, these fables, countless numbers of religions, which I believe are just fairy tales, to explain this thing, this concept we don't understand. But for me, it's clear steps are skipped, important steps that need not be skipped. And as a rational human being, I simply choose not to skip those steps. So I stand there on our finite planet, and I look and I think, wow, outside of us is a universe. And the universe may have no end. It may not have had a beginning. I don't know. What's the Big Bang? That was a big theory, is still a theory to some now, that there was this point of beginning, this Big Bang where the universe was created. But that doesn't solve anything for me. I don't understand it because, well, what was prior to the Big Bang? So for me, it makes much more sense. It seems eminently reasonable that perhaps the universe had no beginning, was always here, and has no end. Difficult, if not impossible, to wrap your head around, but far, far easier, more sensible, more realistic from my perspective, to accept that possibility that the universe had no beginning and has no end, than to think about the guy with the white beard who had no beginning and has no end, the omnipotent, omniscient God who's thinking about each of us all the time, who had no beginning and had no end, who created this thing called the universe. Skipped step, skipped, weirdness. Religion makes no sense. It's almost insanity. I hate to even say almost. It feels to me as if people have turned off a piece of this very powerful tool, our brains, in order to accept this idea that there's some being who created all of this. So this thing, this supposed being that's a part of all religions that had no beginning and has no end is so irrational from my perspective to consider that it's that there is no other choice for me other than to be atheistic, to be in a position where I think it's unlikely that there is any such thing as a deity of any sort. I go further to spirituality and this whole idea of an afterlife, an other world, ghosts and spirits. And I just think it's all utter, absolute nonsense in the literal sense. Nonsense. Doesn't make sense because we've skipped the most logical, possibility, the most logical way of looking at it. And until those kinds of questions are answered that cause me to think it's reasonable to believe that there is something that had no beginning or end, I'll look and entertain the idea that what we can see, what we are most clear about, the idea that we are existing within space, within the universe, that maybe the universe had no beginning and had no end. I don't know. I'm not concerned with knowing. I would love to know because I'm curious, but I don't. And I'm not going to, I'm absolutely unwilling to pretend that that concept, the concept of infinite, is something I can skip and just say, oh, okay, never mind. There's somebody out there that created all this. And that thing, that deity, who you call God or whatever you might call them in your religion, created this thing that I don't know whether it had a beginning or an end. This seemingly infinite universe in which we are minusculely living upon a pebble floating in it, this sphere called Earth, upon which everything is finite. Anything to which we've ever been exposed or comprehend or think about is finite. Isn't that more simple? Doesn't that make more sense? Hey, you! Yeah, you! Watching the video, you thought it was over. No, you got a job to do. Click the like button and subscribe right below. Come on, get on it now! And feel free to comment. Go ahead, tell me how arrogant I am. Tell me how much you can't stand this or that. I'll listen. Comment away.